all those other years when it was kind of a factor in our lives, it was always just, I had my mother stolen from me. Then when I went back and I thought about, well, this guy held a gun to my mother's head, made her have with him, and then killed her. And what was that like for her? Which, I never thought about that for 30 years.
On May 10th, 1970, Albert Moorby, a school teacher, returned home to his family in Gormley Village, Ontario, in Canada. But what awaited him wasn't peace, but rather a nightmare. 34-year-old Doreen Moorby, his wife, lay lifeless in the living room with their helpless 21-month-old son trapped under her body. The horror didn't stop there. Just 13 days later, a similar crime ripped through the nearby town of Palgrave. The victim this time, 38-year-old Helen Ferguson. The police scrambled to find a connection, but the trail ultimately went cold. The case remained unsolved for years, leaving a cloud of fear and unanswered questions hanging heavy in the air. Then, in a strange twist, a development emerged that would finally bring the truth to light. What was this development? And how did it solve the long-forgotten murders? Doreen June Sidor Moorby was born on April 25, 1936. Unfortunately, details about her childhood years remain unknown. Fast forward to the year 1970. Doreen was now a nurse and had found love with a school teacher named Albert J. Moorby. Together, they built a life as husband and wife, and their family grew with the arrival of their son, Brent. The young couple lived in a modern 2-story house just outside Gormley Village, which was a charming community about 30 miles north of Toronto. Life seemed perfect, a picture of domestic bliss. But as fate would have it, their happiness wasn't meant to last. On the morning of May 6, 1970, sometime after 10 o'clock, an unfamiliar car pulled into Doreen's driveway. A man emerged confidently, his steps purposeful, as he marched up the gravel path. The man was of average height and build, with a clean-cut appearance. His features were unremarkable except for his slightly prominent ears. He wore a casual outfit, a checkered shirt paired with a short jacket and slacks. People who saw him later described him as a chameleon, someone who could easily blend into any crowd. Doreen, with her characteristic openness, wouldn't have felt any particular alarm when the knock came at her door. However, what the stranger said to convince her to let him inside the house remains a mystery. Perhaps he simply requested to use the phone. Or maybe he fabricated a more elaborate story. We will likely never know for sure. After he managed to get inside, it is believed that he persuaded Doreen to cooperate by showing her a handgun. He might have used Brent, the 21-month-old toddler, as the threat of harm to either him, her, or both to make her obey. What came next would haunt the minds of everyone who cared about her, as well as those who barely knew her. Doreen was forced into the bedroom where she was physically assaulted without mercy. Then, as she thought the nightmare might be ending when she was allowed to pick up Brent and partially dress, she was cruelly shot in the back. Injured and bleeding, she had tried to crawl away, still holding Brent in her arms. But the assailant shot her 5 more times in the back of her head. She had instinctively raised her hands in a futile attempt to shield herself, resulting in both of her index fingers being shot through. Brent, fortunately, was unharmed, but trapped beneath his mother's corpse. After locking the front door behind him, the assailant had made sure to leave minimal evidence of his presence. As the heartless stranger retreated down the gravel driveway, he left behind a scene of absolute horror, as Doreen's lifeless body remained cradling her son, even in death. Albert Moorby walked through his front door after a long day of classes, but the sight that greeted him wasn't the usual warm welcome of home. Instead, he was left frozen, still, in the doorway. Sprawled on the living room floor lay his wife Doreen. Panic clawed at his throat as he rushed to her side. Thankfully, their young son was safe and sound. Wasting no time, Albert had dialed the police. Uniformed officers swarmed the scene, their faces grim as they had begun their investigation. The tranquility of their sleepy rural town, Gormley, had been shattered by this sudden violence. A meticulous examination of the crime scene revealed some unsettling details. The murder weapon was a rare type of revolver, a .22 caliber with a larger ammunition chamber than usual, holding 9 bullets. But the killer wasn't careless. He had carefully wiped down surfaces to remove any fingerprints. Even the shell casings had vanished without a trace. The only oddity in this calculated crime was the locked front door. The most disturbing aspect of the murder, however, was its randomness. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication that Doreen had been stalked or threatened. As far as anyone could tell, she had simply been going about her day when a stranger approached her house, knocked on the door, and ended her life in a senseless act of violence. The police were baffled by the seemingly random act of violence. They had a locked house, a missing murder weapon, and a seemingly random victim. It was a puzzle with no clear pieces, and as they grappled with the unanswered questions, they had no idea that an even darker chapter was about to unfold. 13 days had crawled by, thick with tension and unanswered questions. Then, on May 19, 1970, just a few miles east in Palgrave, Ontario, a chilling echo of the Gormley tragedy ripped through another quiet neighborhood. Here, too, a young family's life was shattered by violence, and once again, a child witnessed the horror firsthand. The victim this time was Helen Ferguson, a 38-year-old nurse. Like Albert, Helen's husband Russell was also a teacher. 9-year-old Dale, Helen and Russell's son, was home that day as he was suffering from a case of mumps. His mother was at home to take care of him. The day unfolded normally until shortly after lunch, when the family dog's barking cut through the afternoon quiet. A car pulling into the driveway, followed by a knock on the door. It sent a ripple of curiosity through the house. Dale, assuming the visitor wasn't for him, continued watching television, while his mother went to answer. When she returned, she was followed by a stranger, a man Dale had never seen before. Helen explained to Dale that the man had a sick child in the car and needed directions to the hospital. Following this, Helen and the stranger disappeared upstairs, and Dale went back to his program. An hour had passed, punctuated only by the sounds of the television. Then, 3 loud bangs shattered the peaceful afternoon. Moments later, the stranger reappeared, racing through the hallway towards the front door. A chilling detail caught Dale's eye. The man paused for a moment, wiping something off the doorknob. Dale waited until the sounds of the car speeding away reached his ears. He then called out for his mother, his voice echoing, unanswered in the emptiness. There, in the hallway, laid Helen, her body bathed in a pool of blood. Unable to bear the sight any longer, Dale scrambled for the phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. At the same time, his father, Russell Ferguson, pulled into the driveway, unaware of the nightmare that awaited him inside. He would soon be met with a scene of unimaginable horror: the discovery of his wife's murder and the sight of his traumatized son. Police cars soon swarmed the Ferguson residence, and officers cordoned off the area. The investigation had started that same day. A careful search revealed a terrible truth. The crime scene looked just like the one where Doreen was killed. Both Helen and Doreen had been viciously attacked. The way they were shot was almost the same as well. 2 bullets in the head and 1 in the back. It was like the killer was leaving a morbid calling card. Also, just like before, there were no empty bullet casings to be found, and no fingerprints anywhere. Back then, figuring out someone's DNA from a crime scene wasn't even an option. But the investigators had collected some other evidence during their investigation. A sample of the attacker's bodily fluids recovered from the defiled victims. When they had it tested, they learned that the killer had a specific blood type, type A secretor. Then came a sickening realization. This blood type matched the killer from Gormley exactly. It became increasingly clear this wasn't a random attack, but the work of a cunning serial killer. The peaceful towns of Gormley and Palgrave were now connected by a trail of blood, and the fear of another attack hung heavy in the air. There was a glimmer of hope, though. Unlike the first crime scene, this time they had a witness, young Dale Ferguson. He bravely told the police about the man he saw, the one the newspapers would soon call the .22 caliber killer. Dale described him as having a dark complexion, somewhere between 35 and 40 years old, of average height, and driving a beige Rambler car, possibly a 1964-65 model. He mentioned that he had only seen the man for a brief moment, so some details might be off. Armed with this information and a sketch of the suspect based on Dale's description, the investigators launched a massive manhunt, the biggest Ontario had ever seen at the time. One of the officers involved in the initial task force investigating these murders was a young constable named Don McNeil, who would later become a veteran detective inspector. Despite the intense investigation, with hundreds of tips pouring in every day and having over 2,000 suspects checked out, by the end of 1970, they were met with a dead end. The trail had gone cold, leaving the 2 killings unsolved and a community gripped by fear. 25 years passed with no answers in the Helen and Doreen murders. The towns of Gormley and Palgrave were left with just cold memories of the terror. Then, in June 1995, hundreds of miles away in Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, a string of robberies offered a strange twist.
It began in June of 1995 with a robbery in a private residence. Shortly after that, there was a robbery that we became aware of at a boutique. Then there was a robbery at a fur and jewelry store that took place beside the courthouse here in Sault Ste. Marie.
They weren't your typical robberies. The thief was a clever one. He targeted homes and businesses, looking for people who were alone and vulnerable, old folks or women. He would come up with a story posing as a potential buyer interested in advertised goods or services. In one case, an elderly man was selling a hospital bed. The robber acted interested, then said he had to talk to his wife. He came back the next day, and the man trusted him. But when the man wasn't looking, the robber tied him up, gagged him, and stole his money and valuables. This modus operandi became the robber's signature. He would restrain his victims, often using blindfolds alongside the bindings, striking fear into the hearts of those targeted. These robberies spanned homes and even businesses, including shops selling jewelry and fur. But the robber soon made a big mistake. He tried to sell a stolen ring in a pawn shop in Sudbury, Ontario, using his driver's license as ID. That mistake gave the police the break they needed. They finally had a name for the robber: Ronald West, a 48-year-old man. This news was shocking. Ronald wasn't just some criminal. He used to be a police officer. He joined the Toronto police force in his early 20s, way back in 1966, but quit just a few years later in 1972. The reason for him leaving the force wasn't clear, but records said he had resigned to find a different job. Ronald was married with 2 sons and seemed to be living a normal life with his second wife in Blind River, Ontario. For 2 days, police officers patiently observed Ronald from a nearby boathouse, suspecting him of criminal activity. Their suspicions were confirmed on June 30th, 1995, when a large police force raided his house after spotting him using a cell phone outside. The search uncovered a trove of stolen jewelry, hidden within his home and vehicles. Evidence of tampering was also found. Many rings had been damaged in an attempt to remove their precious stones. Realizing their investigation had yielded results, the police promptly arrested Ronald. Knowing he couldn't fight the charges, Ronald pleaded guilty to the robberies in August of that year. The judge, upon sentencing, delivered a scathing rebuke, calling Ronald's crimes shocking and coldly planned, acts that inflicted immense terror on his victims. Ronald was sentenced to 10 years in prison. As 1995 drew to a close, an inspector named Ed Pellerin had found himself in southern Ontario for a routine annual case review. Fate intervened when he ended up chatting with none other than Inspector Don McNeil about the Ronald West file. Pellerin mentioned offhandedly that after Ronald's imprisonment, his house in Blind River had been sold. During renovations, the new owners had stumbled upon a crucial piece of evidence. Tucked away in a plastic bag, hidden behind the bathroom ceiling tiles, they discovered a permit for a specific 9-shot .22 caliber revolver. The permit, issued on December 29, 1969, was registered in Ronald's name. Intriguingly, the purchase of the weapon itself could be traced back to 1972, just after Ronald had resigned from the police force. This detail sent a jolt through McNeil. The permit matched the description of the very same gun used in the unsolved murders of Doreen and Helen back in 1970.
It was for a 9-shot .22 caliber pistol. The weapon believed to be used in the 1970 murders was believed to be a 9-shot .22 caliber pistol.
Deciding to investigate further, McNeil dug deeper and discovered that Ronald had been off-duty during both killings. Additionally, it came to light that Ronald had frequently vacationed in the same area as Doreen Moorby, one of the victims. McNeil then reached out to officers who had served alongside Ronald in the 53rd Division of the Metropolitan Toronto Police. Their recollections painted a picture of a quiet, unassuming officer. He had competently performed his duties, but never went above and beyond the call of duty. The wheels of justice, though slow, eventually turned. Doreen and Helen's murders, which had already been classified as cold cases, were given a second life. McNeil, ever determined, found himself back on the investigation. One promising path seemed to be the preserved samples collected from the victims back in 1970. Thankfully, technology had caught up. A breakthrough came in the form of a letter which Ronald sent home to his wife from jail. Forensic analysis of the letter yielded a saliva sample.
The person who had licked the postage stamp may well have been the person who both of these women. The frequency of occurrence might have been perhaps 1 in 1,000 for this combined profile, which would mean that if you had 10,000 men in any one area, that any 10 of them could have contributed this particular sample.
Using this, investigators were able to build a strong enough case to obtain a court order for a blood test from Ronald himself. The results were undeniable. It was a match. Nearly 30 years after the horrific murders, this conclusive evidence finally led police to arrest Ronald for the unsolved killings. Ironically, during the initial investigation in 1970, over 3,000 suspects were interviewed. It's almost unbelievable that Ronald, who would have likely been part of the original manhunt for the murderer himself, somehow slipped through the cracks. His name never even appeared on the suspect list. Justice, though delayed, was finally served. On August 26, 1999, at the age of 52, Ronald was charged with first-degree murder for the 1970 assaults and killings. He ultimately pleaded guilty on August 7, 2001, and received 2 life sentences. Today, he remains incarcerated in an undisclosed medium security institution.